Hey guys, tonight we're going deep underground, not metaphorically, literally. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's talk about what might be resting beneath the sands of northern Mexico. Because in this episode we re-unraveling one of the strangest archaeological whispers in the Americas, the story of the mummified giants said to have been unearthed beneath the desert valleys, tucked away in forgotten caves and mines, and later quietly removed from public sight. Of course, this is Ancient Aliens, which means the story won't just stop at dusty skeletons. Oh no, we're going to ask whether these massive, desiccated beings were actually remnants of an ancient hybrid race. A race that might have walked the earth long before official history even started taking notes. So, let's start where most legends do. With a farmer and a shovel. The unearthing, it's the late 1930s, in the arid hills of Chihuahua, Mexico. A mining crew was digging near the edge of what locals called La Cueva del Gigante. Literally, the cave of the giant. The miners weren't looking for giants, of course. They were after minerals. But as they dug deeper, they stumbled onto something far stranger than copper veins or silver, or inside a dry cavern, half collapsed and hidden by centuries of sand. They reportedly found several massive human-like figures. Now, massive is a generous word in archaeology, but in this case, the measurements are oddly specific. The mummified remains were said to be between 8 and 12 feet tall, with elongated skulls, long torsos and rib cages, too wide for an ordinary human frame. Their skin was still clinging to bone, leathery and tanned by time. And their hair, if you believe the accounts, was still visible in patches of reddish-brown. No photographs survived, at least none that mainstream researchers accept. But witnesses from nearby villages describe seeing crates hauled out under guard, driven off toward an unspecified research facility. And then, silence. Because of course, nothing says normal day at the dig site, like finding a 12-foot mummy, and pretending it never happened. Local legends long before miners with lanterns entered those hills. The native Raramuri people of the region already had stories. Stories of the ones who came before. They spoke of tall beings who once lived in the mountains, towering over ordinary men, who built the first shelters in the cliffs and vanished long before the Spanish ever arrived. The Raramuri never called them gods, just others. Spanish chroniclers who passed through northern Mexico in the 16th century also wrote of ruins too large for human habitation, doorways too high, stone steps too steep. To them, it was just another sign of a lost civilization wiped away by time. But in the eyes of Ancient Aliens theorists, these might not be myths at all. They could be fragmented memories of something very real, something that doesn't fit neatly into the family tree of Homo sapiens. Because if these giants really did exist, where did they come from? The giant question. Let's pause and zoom out. The idea of giants isn't unique to Mexico. It's everywhere. In the Bible, you've got the Nephilim, those mysterious sons of God who took human wives and produced beings of great size and strength. In ancient Greece, the Titans. In Norse mythology, in Mesoamerican stories, the Quinametsin, enormous beings who built the ancient pyramids before being destroyed by the gods for their arrogance. Every culture, separated by oceans and millennia, somehow agreed on one oddly consistent story. Before us, there were bigger people. Now, skeptics will say, sure, giants are just metaphors for ancient heroes. Myths, not measurements. But Ancient Aliens researchers suggest another angle. What if these myths are memories? Memories of a time when something else, something not entirely human, walked among us. If extraterrestrial visitors really did influence early human civilization, as the show often asks, then genetic experimentation could explain a lot. Hybrid offspring, enhanced physiology, maybe even extended lifespans that allowed them to become legends. And what's more, many giant discoveries around the world seem to have one eerily consistent trait: elongated skulls and odd connections. The skulls reportedly found in northern Mexico were said to be longer and narrower than normal. Not in a head-binding way, but anatomically different. The kind of difference you can't just shape with cloth. Now, elongation practices did exist in ancient Mesoamerica, especially among the Maya and the Olmec, as symbols of nobility or divine status. But researchers like Brian Forster have pointed out that in some cases, the cranial volume of certain elongated skulls, like those found in Peru's Paracas region, is 25% larger than an average human head. That's not just cosmetic, that's biological. So, was someone imitating these beings through artificial skull binding? Or were those ancient nobles trying to look like the real thing, a hybrid species, remembered as gods or giants? It's a strange idea, but so is an 8-foot mummy in a cave. Suppressed discoveries. Here's where the story gets murkier. And, of course, more interesting. Over the decades, there have been dozens of reports of oversized skeletons found across North America. From the red-haired mummies of Nevada's Lovelock Cave to the alleged giant bones discovered by early ranchers in Sonora, Mexico. Most of these finds, according to reports, were quietly collected by early 20th century archaeologists, many of them working under the Smithsonian Institution. And curiously, none of those skeletons have ever reappeared. Coincidence? Maybe. But this pattern has fueled decades of speculation that an academic cover-up might be in play. The idea goes like this. If physical evidence of non-human or hybrid species were ever proven real, it would completely rewrite everything we think we know about human history. And let's be honest, universities don't exactly love rewriting entire timelines. So it's easier perhaps to file those bones away and let the desert reclaim its secrets. The theories. So, what are these mummified giants supposed to be? There are 3 main theories, depending on how far you want to float off the mainstream map. Theory 1. Lost humans. The simplest version says these were simply an unusually tall prehistoric tribe, maybe due to genetic anomalies or environmental factors. A race of robust humans who lived in isolation and died out before recorded history. Theory 2. Ancient hybrids. Then there's the ancient astronaut theory that these giants were genetic experiments, the offspring of extraterrestrial beings who interbred with early humans to create physically superior hybrids. Theory 3. Misinterpretation or myth. And finally, the skeptical one, that reports of giants are the result of exaggeration, mismeasured bones, or plain hoax. But if you line up the stories from Mexico to Peru to the American Southwest, it's hard not to notice how the details match. Massive bones, elongated skulls, sudden disappearances of artifacts, and always local myths warning that these beings were wiped out by the gods. Or maybe something else wiped them out. The sleepy speculation. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds like bedtime nonsense, and you'd be right to think that. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? Because whether these giants were real hybrid beings, or just myths spun from strange bones and old fears, the idea of them still lingers in the desert air. You can almost picture them, silent, preserved by the dry Mexican heat, resting in stone chambers carved before history began, their eyes long gone, their stories half remembered, and above them, humans, still arguing about where we really came from. Let's float onward, deeper into the sands, and see what else the earth might be hiding from us. So, we left off with the image of those silent giants, lying in the desert darkness, and the strange hush that always seems to follow whenever their story comes up. Tonight, let's drift a little deeper into the 20th century, when a handful of curious archaeologists, miners, and wanderers started whispering about what they'd seen in the caves of northern Mexico. Because, as it turns out, the idea of mummified giants wasn't just a one-time story. It kept resurfacing quietly, stubbornly, like the desert itself trying to remember something. Forgotten excavations in the 1960s. A researcher named Pablo Martinez del Rio, one of Mexico's leading archaeologists, published a short paper about abnormally large skeletal remains found in the state of Sonora. He didn't call them giants that would have ended his career, but he did describe tall individuals averaging well over 7 feet, buried in unusual positions. The report was tucked away in an academic journal and barely mentioned again. But what's interesting is the detail. The remains were wrapped in fibrous cloth, dried naturally in arid air, and placed in stone-lined pits facing east, a burial style not consistent with any known local culture. When later researchers went looking for the site, it was gone, bulldozed, built over, erased. Because of course it was. Now, if this were just one dusty report, fine, but across Mexico, stories like this keep popping up. Small mentions, old photos, half-lost museum records that no one seems eager to talk about. The caves near Durango, the high valleys of Sonora, the remote desert tombs outside Hermosillo. Each time, it's the same, human-like remains, just too large, and almost always, those remains end up transferred for study, and never seen again. The miners' accounts in the 1970s. Retired miners in Chihuahua gave a series of interviews to a local newspaper, El Heraldo del Norte. They described unearthing what they called human mummies of impossible size. One man claimed the skeleton's skull was as big as a water bucket, and that the femur bone, the upper leg, was longer than a grown man's torso. Another described rows of what looked like ritual carvings along the walls. Crude, geometric, almost alien. No photos were published. The paper was small, rural, and half its archives were later destroyed in a fire. Conveniently, still, oral accounts persisted. Older locals told visiting journalists that soldiers arrived soon after the finds, sealing off access to the caves, supposedly for safety reasons. It's all very neat and tidy. Almost too tidy. Government silence now. It's worth noting, official archaeology in Mexico has always been tightly controlled. The National Institute of Anthropology and History, INA, is cautious with discoveries, sometimes to a fault. So, if something didn't fit within known history, say, skeletons twice the size of a normal human, it's not hard to imagine the data being quietly shelved. That's not a conspiracy, it's just bureaucracy. Institutions prefer things that make sense. 12-foot mummies don't. Still, a few stubborn researchers kept digging, figuratively and literally. The case of the Hermosillo mummy in 1985, a local museum curator in Hermosillo, Sonora, claimed to have received a mummified body of great stature from a private collector. The specimen was supposedly found in a sealed chamber carved into a sandstone ridge, wrapped in woven plant fiber and coated in a reddish mineral powder. The curator measured it at roughly 9 feet 2 inches tall. He noted elongated fingers, unusual joint proportions, and a distinctly narrow cranium. The mummy was never displayed. A few months later, the museum's director stated in an interview that no such specimen existed. The curator left the institution shortly after, and so the pattern repeats. Discovery, denial, disappearance, like clockwork. Could it all be folklore? Maybe. Folklore has a long half-life. The deserts of Mexico are filled with strange shapes, wind-carved rocks, animal bones, and half-buried ruins that can easily spark stories. And when you're working under the blazing sun, it's easy to let your imagination stretch a little taller than usual. But that doesn't explain the consistency, the recurring measurements, the reports from miners, farmers, even priests who swore they'd seen something enormous, human-like, and perfectly preserved. And it doesn't explain why similar accounts exist across continents. Because at the same time that Mexico's miners were talking about desert mummies, farmers in Peru were unearthing elongated skulls in Paracas. Meanwhile, in Nevada, archaeologists were dusting off the remains of the so-called Lovelock giants, red-haired mummies, reportedly over 8 feet tall. Different places, different times. Same story, almost like fragments of a single forgotten chapter. The visitor's theory. Ancient astronaut theorists like Giorgio Tsoukalos often point to these cases as evidence of hybridization, the blending of extraterrestrial and human DNA thousands of years ago. The idea goes something like this: beings from another world or dimension, depending on how poetic you feel, arrived on Earth long ago. They found early humans and tinkered a bit, created hybrids, physically larger, intellectually superior, meant to rule or guide primitive tribes. Some of these hybrids became what we remember as gods, kings, or giants. Others, perhaps, were outcasts left behind when their creators departed, and, when time and nature took their toll, their remains dried into mummified forms, bones too big, skulls too long. The kind of thing that doesn't belong in your average museum catalog. It's a wild theory, but then again, so is most of human history when you look closely enough. The pyramids' connection if we float south from Mexico's deserts toward Teotihuacan, the ancient city of the gods, things get even weirder. The builders of Teotihuacan remain anonymous. We still don't know who they were, where they came from, or why they built such enormous structures aligned with celestial precision. The name Teotihuacan was given later by the Aztecs, who said it meant the place where men became gods. Sound familiar? Now imagine those unknown builders were descendants, or even survivors, of a race of giant beings that once spanned the Americas. Their immense size and strength would have made construction feats like the Pyramid of the Sun far more plausible. Of course, mainstream archaeology insists the pyramids were built by humans using simple tools and clever organization. But it never quite explains how those stones were lifted, or why identical pyramid designs show up all over the world, from Mexico to Egypt to Indonesia. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's the architectural footprint of a civilization we've simply forgotten. The silence of the sand. When you stand in the deserts of Sonora at dusk, everything looks endless, a flat sea of orange and violet light. It's the kind of place that makes you believe anything could be buried out there. And maybe that's why these stories persist. Because deep down, people feel there's still something undiscovered, that beneath the dust, beneath the bones and the ruins, there's a chapter missing. One where humans weren't alone. Maybe the mummified giants were never discovered in the first place. Maybe they were just remembered echoes of a time when the world was stranger, and the line between myth and history was still a blur. Let's drift a bit farther south next, toward Peru and the high plains, where similar giant remains and elongated skulls were found. Maybe the answer isn't buried in one cave, but scattered across continents. Let's float south now, far beyond the deserts of Mexico, across mountain ranges and jungles, until we reach the coast of Peru. It's a place where the wind never really stops. The Paracas Peninsula, a stretch of red desert that looks more Martian than earthly, and it's here, amid these quiet dunes, that another set of strange remains began to surface. They weren't called giants this time. They were just called different. The discovery of the Paracas skulls. Back in 1928, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello, often called the father of Peruvian archaeology, stumbled across something he didn't expect. Inside a series of desert caves, Tello found hundreds of tombs filled with elongated human skulls. Some were wrapped in fine textiles, others stacked neatly, as if preserved with care. At first glance, they looked like victims of intentional head binding, a common cultural practice in ancient Peru, done to shape the skull as a symbol of nobility or status. But as Tello studied the bones more closely, something didn't add up. The cranial volume of several skulls was larger than normal. Not just stretched, actually bigger. Thicker bone density, different suture lines. Some lacked the sagittal suture entirely, the line that runs from the top of the head to the back. In other words, these weren't just reshaped human heads. They might have been something else. The skeptics' response, mainstream researchers brushed it off. They said the skulls were the result of cultural cranial deformation. An old practice, nothing unusual. But a few quiet studies, decades later, suggested otherwise. One 2014 DNA analysis claimed that samples from several Paracas skulls didn't match normal human mitochondrial DNA. Now, those results have never been formally peer-reviewed, and the chain of custody is, let's say, questionable. But the claim alone reignited the debate. Were these people entirely human? And more importantly, why do their physical traits, tall stature, large skulls, reddish hair, sound so familiar? The red-haired giants. Remember the red-haired mummies of Lovelock Cave in Nevada, described by the Paiute tribe as giants who lived in the caves before their ancestors drove them out. Those remains, found in the early 1900s, were also said to have light-colored hair, red or blonde, and unusually large bones. The Paracas skulls, thousands of miles away, shared the same trait. Red hair, preserved in the dry desert air. Coincidence? Maybe. But to ancient aliens theorists, this pattern hints at something more. a lost lineage that spanned the Americas long before recorded civilization. A race of tall, possibly hybrid beings with cranial structures distinct from ours. Ancient maritime travelers. If you look at a map, Paracas sits right along the Pacific coast. Archaeologists have found evidence that the Paracas people were skilled seafarers. They built red boats, navigated currents, and even traded along the shoreline. Some theorists take this further. They suggest these ancient mariners might have traveled north, up the coastlines of Ecuador, Central America, and into Mexico, long before the Aztecs or Maya ever existed. If that's true, then maybe the so-called mummified giants of Mexico and the elongated skulls of Paracas share a common origin. A single, ocean-faring civilization that existed before history and then vanished, leaving behind scattered traces of bones and legend. Gods, kings, and visitors. Nearly every ancient culture in South and Central America speaks of sky beings, luminous gods who descended from above, taught agriculture, and demanded reverence. The Incas called them Viracachis, tall, pale-skinned beings with beards who arrived from across the sea. The Aztecs spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who brought knowledge and vanished, promising to return. And in both stories, there's that same undertone. These weren't just gods, they were teachers, physical beings, remembered as divine because they were different. Ancient astronaut theorists often connect these myths to the same global pattern. Cultures all over the world describing sky gods who descend, teach, and depart. Maybe they weren't gods at all. Maybe they were travelers. And maybe some of them stayed. The genetic puzzle, if hybridization really happened, if early humans mixed with non-human feathers, what would we expect to see in the fossil record? Probably something like this. Anatomical variations that don't match known evolution. Sudden leaps in brain size or cranial shape. Odd gaps in human migration patterns. That is exactly what we see between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE period. Archaeologists call the Neolithic transition. Around that time, humans in multiple regions suddenly developed agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, as if someone handed them the manual for civilization. And if you believe the ancient aliens' perspective, maybe someone did. Burial practices and cosmic symbolism. The Paracas tombs weren't random. They were aligned with the stars. Most of them faced southeast toward the rising of specific constellations, possibly Orion or the Pleiades, both sacred in Andean mythology. The same constellations, interestingly, that appear in ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian alignments. So what are the odds that three completely separate cultures, separated by oceans, built their sacred sites in the same stellar pattern? Sure, skeptics say it's coincidence or shared human symbolism, but even coincidences start looking suspicious when they repeat across hemispheres. And in the ancient aliens' worldview, these alignments aren't random. They're markers, reminders of where the visitors came from. The disappearing evidence, much like the stories in Mexico, many Paracas skulls that were once displayed in small museums have quietly disappeared. Collectors claim they were relocated for conservation. Others were lost during transfers. But researchers who saw them firsthand, including Brian Forster and several local curators, insist that some skulls showed features that couldn't be explained by human anatomy alone. It's as if the more unusual the specimen, the faster it vanishes. And maybe that's exactly how history keeps itself tidy. The quiet implication: if even one of these remains turned out to be non-human, everything about human history would have to be rewritten. Not metaphorically, literally. Every museum exhibit, every timeline, every comfortable story about how civilization began. And perhaps that's why no one's in a hurry to dig too deep. Because whether it's the mummified giants of Mexico, the red-haired beings of Nevada, or the elongated skulls of Paracas, the pattern keeps whispering the same thing. There was something else here before us. Something intelligent. Something powerful. And maybe something that wanted to be remembered. Let's drift onward, just a little further south, into the high mountains of the Andes, where mummified remains of children, sacrificed to the gods, were found perfectly preserved at 20,000 feet. Because there, in the thin air of the peaks, lies another mystery, one that ties back to giants, gods, and visitors from the stars. Let us keep floating south, high above the coastal sands and deep into the mountains of the Andes. If the deserts of Mexico and Peru whisper of giants buried beneath the earth, then the Andes murmur something different, something colder, something that lives in the thin air, where even birds hesitate to fly. This is where we find the Incan mummies. Perfectly preserved children, found frozen at altitudes that should be impossible for human survival. And two ancient aliens theorists, they aren't just archaeological remains. They're messages, silent reminders of an ancient pact between humans and the so-called beings of the sky. The mountain tombs. In 1999, archaeologists climbing Mount Lulilako on the border between Chile and Argentina made a discovery so hauntingly perfect that even the most cynical researchers had to pause. Inside a small stone chamber near the summit, they found 3 children, a girl around 15, a younger girl about 6, and a boy roughly 8. They weren't skeletons. They were still human. Their skin, their clothes, their hair, all preserved by the freezing cold. It looked as though they'd simply fallen asleep centuries ago and never woken up. The children were dressed in elaborate Incan garments. Their faces were serene. No signs of trauma, no evidence of fear. According to official history, there were kapuka sacrifices, offerings to the gods of the mountains, meant to bring good harvests or prevent disasters. But to ancient aliens researchers, there's another possibility. These weren't sacrifices to imaginary gods. They were offerings to visitors. The sky beings throughout Incan mythology, the gods weren't distant. They descended from above, from the sun, from the stars, from the clouds. The Inca called themselves the children of the sun, born from the union of the sky god Inti and the earth itself. Their rulers, the Sapa Inca, were said to be part divine, not metaphorically, but literally. So when priests carried children up mountains like Lulilako, it might not have been an act of blind faith. It might have been a reenactment of something much older. A story of beings who came down from the heavens and demanded tributes in their own image. And the children, chosen for their purity, may have been seen as the closest humans could get to that divine bloodline. Genetic curiosities. Some researchers have quietly noted that several Andean mummies, particularly from high-altitude sites, display physical traits that seem atypical for native populations. Lighter hair, narrower facial features, even slightly larger cranial capacity. Most of that can be explained by variation, malnutrition, or environmental factors. But in the ancient aliens community, these anomalies fuel a more speculative idea. What if the Incas and earlier Andean cultures interbred with beings who weren't fully human? That would explain the royal obsession with preserving pure bloodlines, the emphasis on celestial ancestry, and the recurring depictions of tall, pale figures descending from the sky in ancient Andean art. Mainstream scholars, of course, see symbolism, but symbolism has a habit of leaving fingerprints. The lines in the desert just west of the Andes lies another mystery, one that seems to scream for attention, though no one on the ground can see it. The Nazca lines, enormous geometric figures etched into the desert floor, birds, monkeys, serpents, and perfect straight lines stretching for miles. The Nazca people made them over 1,500 years ago. Officially, they're thought to be ritual paths or astronomical markers. But from the sky, they look unmistakably like landing strips. Long, level clearings cut through rock and sand, visible only from the air. Convenient, if your guards happen to visit on something that needed a runway. To us, they look like art. To ancient eyes, maybe they were invitations. Connecting the threads by now, you might be noticing a pattern. The mummified giants of Mexico. The elongated skulls of Paracas. The frozen children of the Andes. 3 cultures. 3 landscapes. 3 very different kinds of remains. And yet, they all circle around the same strange theme. Human beings reaching upward, toward the sky, as if they were remembering someone who used to come down from it. The Incas built their shrines on the highest mountains. The Nazca carved messages big enough for the heavens to read. The desert giants of the north were buried in caves that looked up at the stars. Different expressions of the same obsession. The sky, the silence of the mountains. When you stand on the summit of Lulilako today, it's almost unnervingly quiet. The wind doesn't roar, it sighs. The air is so thin that even your thoughts seem to slow down, and somewhere beneath your feet lie the frozen remains of 3 children who were told they were joining the gods. It's easy to dismiss that as superstition. But maybe it was memory. Maybe their ancestors had actually seen something descend once. A shining being, a craft, a presence, and generations later, they were still reenacting that moment. In that sense, the sacrifices weren't offerings. They were reenactments of contact, a way of saying, "We remember you. We are still waiting." The mummified continuum. It's strange how all these preserved bodies, from the deserts of Mexico to the summits of the Andes, seem linked by one thing: they don't decay. Desert air, mountain frost, volcanic soil, nature itself seems to have conspired to keep them intact, as if the planet wanted us to find them. Maybe they're just a coincidence of climate and geology, or maybe, in a more poetic sense, the earth itself remembers. It remembers a time when different kinds of beings walked across its surface, taller, stranger, wiser perhaps, and it keeps leaving their stories tucked under the sand for us to rediscover. The echo of bloodlines. In Incan tradition, royal lineages were sacred because they carried divine ancestry. The Sapa Inca was not just a ruler, he was literally considered a descendant of the gods. That same idea shows up everywhere. Pharaohs of Egypt, sons of Ra. Chinese emperors, sons of heaven. Mayan kings, children of the stars. It's the same story retold in a dozen languages. Power justified by cosmic DNA. But what if, in the distant past, that wasn't metaphorical? What if, at the very start, the first kings and queens actually were hybrids, the offspring of the visitors, who came from above, and the early humans who lived below? If so, the mummified giants, the skulls, the sacrificed children, all of them might be echoes of a single global story, one that begins not with us, but with them. Sleepy speculation now. Whether you believe any of this or not doesn't really matter, because the fun of these stories isn't improving them, it's in wondering. Wondering why the same myths keep appearing, why the same physical anomalies turn up in faraway places, why we keep finding traces of people who shouldn't exist. Maybe it's all coincidence, or maybe it's a faint memory, the genetic echo of something our species met, learned from, and then lost. But every time another mummy surfaces, another cave is opened, another skull is dusted off, the story whispers again they were here, and maybe, just maybe, they still are. Let us drift into the next chapter, where we will look at how ancient architecture across the Americas seems to align with the same celestial patterns found in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Because if the builders of these sites were connected, then maybe the giants weren't just buried here. Maybe they built here. If the mummified giants were real, if they once walked among the people of Mexico, Peru, and beyond, then there's a question we can't avoid: where are their cities? Bones can disappear. Stories can fade. But stone doesn't lie. And across the Americas, stone seems to remember something that the rest of history forgot. The impossible builders let us start where every ancient mystery seems to begin, with walls that shouldn't exist. High in the Peruvian Andes lies the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. Its walls are made from enormous blocks of andesite, some weighing over 300 tons. Each stone fits the next, with eerie precision. No mortar, no gaps, not even a blade of grass between them. Modern engineers still can't explain how the Incas, without iron tools or the wheel, managed to move and carve them. When asked, early chroniclers recorded that local elders gave a simple answer: the giants built it. It sounds like folklore, but that same phrase, the giants built it, echoes across the world. In Mexico, the Toltec ruins of Tula were once said to be raised by a race of enormous men who came before humans. In Bolivia, the Tiwanaku complex was also credited to divine beings with superhuman strength. And in the American Southwest, the Anasazi legends describe star people who taught architecture and then vanished. Different languages. Same story, same kind of stone, the silent engineers. When we look closer at these structures, the mystery deepens. Across continents, the same design principles appear: interlocking polygonal blocks that resist earthquakes, stones shaped to fit like puzzle pieces, not simple rectangles, massive terraces aligned with solar events. To some archaeologists, that's just convergent evolution, ancient builders figuring out similar tricks. But to others, it's evidence of shared knowledge passed across oceans long before Columbus. And if you listen to the ancient aliens theorists, that knowledge didn't come from other humans. It came from the sky, the star map beneath our feet in Mexico, the pyramids of Teotihuacan, form a celestial map. The three main structures, the pyramids of the sun, the moon, and the feathered serpent, align perfectly with the three stars of Orion's belt. Thousands of miles away, the same alignment appears at Giza in Egypt. No written connection, no shared culture, and yet the same stars, the same layout, the same obsession with the heavens. It's as if both civilizations were following blueprints drawn from above. The builders of Teotihuacan didn't just orient their city by chance. Every street, every platform, every temple aligns with cosmic cycles, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of specific stars. It's not architecture, it's astronomy carved into stone. And that's exactly what ancient aliens theorists love to point out. The same fingerprints appear on structures continents apart, hinting at one source of advanced knowledge, a civilization that existed long before recorded history. The handprints of giants in the valley of Oaxaca. Archaeologists found massive stone tools, hammers, grinders, and chisels too large for any ordinary human hand. Most were dismissed as ritual objects. But if we take the ancient stories literally, these weren't ceremonial. They were practical. They belonged to the beings who built before the flood, before humanity, before memory. Even the Maya spoke of the Itzamna, those who came from the sea and the stars. They were tall, pale, and radiant. They taught writing, astronomy, and building. When their work was done, they returned to the heavens. The Aztecs had a similar legend about Quinametzin, the race of giants destroyed by the gods for their arrogance. To modern eyes, these are just stories. But the ruins don't care what we believe. They sit there, unmoving, like evidence waiting for someone brave enough to read it differently. Technology in stone. Let's pause for a second. How do you carve a 100-ton block of granite so precisely that it locks with another at 10 irregular angles? You don't, not easily. Yet at sites like Ollantaytambo and Pumapunku, that's exactly what we see. Stone surfaces so smooth they look machined. Corners so sharp they could cut glass. Some researchers have proposed that ancient builders might have used heat, sound, or vibration to shape stone technologies that sound more like science fiction than archaeology. In the ancient aliens community, this is often linked to the idea of sonic levitation, using sound frequencies to move and mold matter. It's a wild thought, but again, ancient texts from Egypt, India, and the Americas all describe gods who sang or spoke things into existence. Maybe it was metaphor, maybe it was memory. The forgotten architects. So if the giants built these structures, if they passed down techniques, humanity barely remembers what happened to them. Every culture seems to have the same ending to that story: a flood, a punishment, or a disappearance. The giants were destroyed, the gods withdrew, and humanity inherited a broken world filled with ruins it didn't understand. From that moment on, civilization became an act of remembering. We copied the blueprints but forgot the purpose. We worshipped the sky but forgot who lived there. The pyramids, the temples, the lines, the mummies, they're all fragments of one ancient puzzle. And the missing piece is always the same: the builders themselves. The celestial blueprint across the globe, every sacred site seems to point upward, not randomly, precisely. The angles of pyramids match the tilt of Earth. The temples mirror constellations. Even burial sites face specific stars. If the purpose was merely spiritual, any direction would do. But the consistency suggests communication. A message written across centuries, visible only from above. What if the layout of ancient cities was a signal? A message to the visitors who once walked among them. A reminder that their children, their hybrid descendants, still looked to the sky and waited for their return. Memory in the mountains. When you stand at Sacsayhuaman at dusk, the stones seem to glow, orange fading into violet as the sun slips behind the Andes. It's silent, almost reverent, and if you listen closely, you can almost imagine the deep hum of voices, the echo of builders who carved their knowledge into the bedrock of time. They didn't write it in books. They wrote it in mountains, and somehow, their language of geometry still speaks. Maybe that's what the mummies, the giants, and the temples were all trying to say. We were here, we built this. Don't forget us. The human question whether or not giants truly existed. These stories remind us of something uncomfortable. We might not be the first intelligent species to walk the earth. Our history might not be a straight line. It might be a circle rising and falling. Civilization after civilization, each one leaving faint clues for the next. And somewhere, buried under centuries of dust, the bones of those first builders are still waiting to be found, waiting to be believed. The whisper of stone. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine the stars above Mexico, the shadows of ancient pyramids stretching across the desert, and the wind slipping through the cracks of thousand-year-old walls. You're not just hearing wind, you're hearing history. You're hearing the ghosts of giants. They were the architects of the impossible, the forgotten teachers of humankind. And maybe, just maybe, they are still watching from the same stars they once came from. So far, we've wandered through deserts, climbed ruined temples, and listened to stone walls whisper about the past. Now it's time to ask the question no one really wants to say out loud. If these mummified giants truly existed, and if they came from somewhere beyond this world, could their blood, in some quiet, diluted form, still flow through us today? The bones that shouldn't exist in several sites across northern Mexico and Peru. Local legends speak of giant graves. Some were said to contain skeletons far taller than any known people, 8 feet, 9, sometimes more. Most of those remains disappeared long before any scientific record. They were collected by early explorers, priests, or government officials, and then quietly lost. Official archaeology calls them misidentifications. And yet, the pattern repeats again and again, from Mexico to the American Southwest, even into the Pacific Islands. Everywhere, the same stories surface. Massive bones, strange skull shapes, and red or blonde hair that shouldn't exist among local populations. Coincidence? Maybe. But as we've learned, ancient coincidence tends to wear the same face. The Paracas skulls let us float south for a moment, to the windswept cliffs of the Paracas Peninsula in Peru. Here, in the 1920s, archaeologist Julio Tello uncovered hundreds of elongated skulls. At first glance, they looked like examples of cranial deformation, a cultural practice where infant skulls were bound to create a stretched shape. Except, some of the Paracas skulls were different. The bone density was heavier, the cranial volume was up to 25% larger, and most strikingly, they had only one parietal plate instead of two. That's not something you can fake with head binding. That's anatomy. DNA tests, limited and controversial, hinted that these individuals didn't match known indigenous lineages. Their maternal haplogroups traced back to the Near East and even parts of the Black Sea region, thousands of miles away. It's not proof of aliens, but it is proof of something unexpected, a bloodline that shouldn't be there. And when we place that alongside Mexico's legends of pale-skinned giants, the lines begin to connect in strange ways. The hybrid hypothesis. According to many ancient traditions, the gods didn't just visit, they mingled. They walked among humans, married, and produced children. In the Book of Enoch, they are called the Nephilim, the giant spawn of heaven and earth. In Sumerian myths, they're the Anunnaki. In Mesoamerican lore, they're the Quinametsin, the old race of giants who lived before the fifth sun. Different names, same story, a merging of heaven and humanity, a forbidden crossing of worlds. Ancient aliens theorists argue that these myths preserve a distorted memory of genetic experimentation, early attempts by advanced beings to modify life on Earth. And if that's true, then those mummified giants weren't visitors at all. They were prototypes. Early models of humanity built stronger, taller, maybe even smarter, until nature or the gods decided to start over. The DNA enigma. Modern science has uncovered something that still baffles researchers. Around 8% of the human genome consists of foreign DNA sequences that don't seem to come from any known ancestor. Most scientists call them ancient viral insertions, leftover code from infections millions of years ago. But that explanation feels like a polite shrug. To the ancient aliens crowd, those mysterious genes might be remnants of something more intentional, a genetic signature left by our creators, a kind of cosmic watermark. The blood of the gods in almost every civilization, royal bloodlines, were said to descend from the gods. Egyptian pharaohs called themselves children of Ra. Mayan kings claimed lineage from the sky serpent Kukulkan. Even the Aztecs traced their rulers to a divine being who came from the stars in a beam of light. It's a pattern that crosses continents and millennia. The powerful always insist their blood is different. And maybe, once upon a time, it was. The tradition of royal inbreeding, which we often mock for its disastrous results, might have started as an attempt to preserve that ancient alien spark, to keep the divine code pure. It sounds absurd. But remember, the more you look at history, the more it behaves like myth, pretending to be fact. The mummies of the desert in northern Mexico. Locals still speak of El Gigante Blanco, the white giant, whose mummified remains were supposedly found in a cave in the late 1800s. The story claims his body was nearly 9 feet tall, wrapped in woven cloth that shimmered like gold under the light. The remains were allegedly shipped to the United States. As with so many artifacts that don't fit the accepted timeline, they vanished. No museum admits to having them. No record survives, but the legend persists, passed down like a quiet warning. There were others here before us. The genetic bridge. Let's step back. What if the purpose of these ancient visitations wasn't domination, but experimentation? What if Earth was, at least for a while, a living laboratory, a test site for genetic possibilities? Beings of immense intelligence, creating hybrids to bridge the gap between worlds. Maybe that explains the strange mix of traits we see in early remains. The large skulls, unusual height, odd bone density, and sudden bursts of culture and intelligence in humanity's past. Civilization didn't slowly evolve, it appeared. Writing, agriculture, astronomy, all emerging as if someone flipped a switch. If you believe the legends, that someone might not have been human. The sleeping code. There's a phrase whispered in esoteric circles, the awakening of the starblood. It refers to the idea that buried deep in our DNA lies dormant information, waiting for a cosmic signal to reactivate. It sounds poetic, maybe even ridiculous. But think about it. Our genome already carries hidden instructions that only express under specific conditions. What if ancient civilizations knew that? What if they understood the language of genes, the literal code of creation, and encoded their legacy inside us? Maybe the giants didn't vanish. Maybe they became us. The return of the Maker's ancient texts often promise that the gods will return when the stars are right. The Maya had their cycles. The Egyptians had theirs. Even the Aztecs believed each sun age ended and began anew when the cosmic clock reset. If those beings were real, if they once shaped humanity, then perhaps they left with the expectation that their work would one day mature, that we'd reach a point, technologically or spiritually, where we could recognize their fingerprint in our own biology. And maybe, when we finally understand that, the contact we've been waiting for won't come from the sky at all. It'll come from within. The quiet ending. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture those ancient tombs beneath the sands of Mexico. The dust, the silence, the faint outline of a figure too large for its grave. Imagine that, beneath those wrappings, lies not just bone, but memory, a genetic echo of something vast and unearthly. And maybe, as you drift into sleep, you'll feel a little less alone. Because if the stories are true, we're all carrying a trace of the stars, a fragment of those mummified giants, hidden in the code that makes us human. They built the world before us. They shaped the blood within us, and somewhere, beyond the sky, they're still watching, waiting for us to remember who we really are. By now, we follow the trail of the giants from the desert tombs of Mexico to the star maps carved in stone. We've wandered through myths, genes, and whispered histories, but the story doesn't stop in the past. It never really does, because every century or so, the earth gives up a new piece of the puzzle, just enough to remind us that we still don't know everything buried beneath our feet. The finds that vanish. Let's start with a pattern that keeps repeating. Someone digs where they shouldn't. They find something that shouldn't exist. And before anyone can study it properly, it's gone. The 19th century was full of such reports. Massive skeletons unearthed in Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. Stone coffins too large for human proportions. Skulls that seemed oddly elongated. Most were written up in small local papers, then quietly forgotten. Skeptics say it was exaggeration, the way old newspapers loved to spin a story. But believers see something else. A trail of evidence tidied away to protect the accepted version of history. Maybe both are true. History is as much about what we throw out as what we keep. The museum mystery in the archives of Mexico City's old National Museum. There's a record, a simple line in a shipment log from the late 1800s. Un cuerpo momificado, gran tamaño, procedente de Chihuahua, a mummified body, of large size, from Chihuahua. No photograph. No specimen. Just that one note, buried among thousands of entries. Later records show no follow-up, no display, no catalog number. It simply disappears into paper dust. Was it a hoax? A mislabeled find? Or one of those discoveries that makes institutions quietly close the drawer and move on? No one knows. And maybe that's what keeps the legend alive. The open door of maybe. The keepers of the story across Mexico, you still find small towns where elders talk about the gigantes dormidos, the sleeping giants. They say they rest beneath certain hills, their breath stirring the wind that moves across the grass. Some believe those hills are hollow, that deep inside lie caverns lined with smooth stone, filled with the remains of beings who will wake again when the world forgets its arrogance. It's folklore, of course, gentle and poetic. But folklore is how memory survives when facts fade. It keeps the sense that the past was stranger than the textbooks suggest. The Whispering Caves, one of the more persistent legends, comes from the Sierra Madre region. Locals tell of a cave sealed with ancient masonry. When explorers opened it in the early 20th century, they supposedly found not treasure, but sarcophagi. Inside were tall, desiccated figures, wrapped in fine cloth that shimmered like mica. Their bodies crumbled to dust when exposed to air. No record survives of where the remains went or who collected them. Just the story passed down like a warning. The earth remembers more than it reveals. Archaeologists have searched for the cave ever since. They've found others filled with normal burials, pottery, bones, but never that one. And maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries need to stay half awake. The modern seekers today, the idea of ancient giants, sits somewhere between archaeology and internet myth. Researchers debate head-shaped skulls and giant bones. Content creators fill hours of video with glowing eyes and digital maps. But behind the noise, there's still a quiet fascination. Every time a new skeleton is found, someone whispers, "Could this be one of them?" That longing isn't really about giants. It's about wanting history to be bigger, older, deeper, stranger than our small timelines allow. We want to believe there was once something more than us. Something that left fingerprints on our beginnings. The archaeologists caution modern archaeologists don't dismiss legends of giants entirely, at least not as meaningless. They study them as cultural memory. In many ancient societies, the term giant didn't always mean size. It meant power, age, or divine ancestry. When the Aztecs said the Quinametsin built the temples, they might have meant those who came before us and were greater. A respectful way of saying, we inherited what we couldn't make. In that sense, the giants are real. Not as enormous bodies, but as symbols of forgotten civilizations whose achievements still tower over us. The quiet files. From time to time, rumors surface about hidden archives, private collections, sealed boxes in museum basements, or state reports locked away. They're said to hold photos, measurements, or relics that don't fit any known timeline. Most turn out to be misread artifacts, old hoaxes, or misplaced enthusiasm. But the pattern keeps coming back, like a faint hum beneath the noise of modern science. It is not that there is proof being hidden, it is that there is curiosity being protected. Because the more we ask, the more the past starts looking like something we barely understand. The prophecy of return among some Mesoamerican traditions. There's a prophecy that one day, the first builders will return when humans forget their origins. Not as flesh and blood, but as memory. A reawakening of knowledge buried in the earth and in ourselves. To some, that means rediscovering lost technology. To others, it's a call to humility. A reminder that progress doesn't always mean understanding. Every stone we lift, every tomb we open, we're not just digging through soil, we're disturbing the dreams of the ancients. And maybe they still dream of us. The endless search. In the end, the giants remain what they've always been. A mirror. When we look for them, we're really searching for the missing parts of our own story. Whether they were real beings, or just metaphors carved into myth, doesn't matter as much as what they represent. The unending human urge to ask, what if? What if we weren't alone? What if the ones who built the first temples didn't come from here? What if the stars we gaze at are the same ones that once watched their creators leave? Those questions don't have answers. But they keep us curious, and curiosity, more than proof, is what keeps history alive. The final whisper so tonight. As you drift off, imagine that somewhere beneath the deserts of Mexico, the giants still lie in their tombs, not waiting to rise, just waiting to be remembered. The wind above their caves moves the sand like slow water, reshaping the dunes as if time itself were breathing. Maybe that's all the giants ever were. The earth, remembering itself. And in that memory, we find our place. Small, curious, and still looking up. The deeper you look into the story of Mexico's mummified giants, the more it starts to feel less like history and more like a mirror. Every artifact, every rumor, every missing record, they all point back to us. Because the real question isn't where the giants real. It's why do we need them to be? The weight of the unknown. For as long as we've been telling stories, humans have needed something larger than themselves. In ancient times, that meant gods and monsters. Later, it meant explorers, kings, and conquerors. Today, it's ancient astronauts and civilizations that vanished before we began counting time. The giants are part of that pattern, a way for us to reach backward into the fog and feel that something extraordinary once walked the same ground we do. That maybe we didn't start at the bottom, but inherited a world already built by hands older, stronger, wiser. And that's a comforting thought. Because if there were giants before us, then maybe we're not the end of the story, just another chapter. The dust that remembers. Imagine a small desert in northern Mexico. The sun falls like fire, and the rocks glow red. Somewhere under that hard earth, bones sleep, real or imagined. It doesn't matter, because every handful of dust carries stories. The archaeologist calls it stratigraphy, the layers of history stacked like pages, but the storyteller calls it memory. And memory doesn't forget easily. Each time someone digs there, they're not just looking for bones. They're listening for echoes. The scrape of a trowel against stone becomes a kind of language. The past trying to speak again. Maybe one day, someone will listen closely enough to understand what it's been trying to say. The sky connection every time we find one of these stories in Mexico, Peru, or Egypt. It somehow leads back to the same place. The sky, the builders of pyramids, the watchers of stars, the beings who descended or ascended long ago. It's as if the ancients left a message too large for one civilization to hold, a message scattered across continents, waiting to be pieced together. Maybe that's what the giants really were. The idea that humanity didn't build itself alone, that our first teachers might have come from somewhere we still can't reach, and whether that place was another planet or just another age, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the question and the wondering. When the myths return, there's a quiet theory among folklorists that myths never die, they just rest until the world is ready to hear them again. Every few generations, the old stories rise, dressed in new names and new explanations. Giants become Nephilim become extraterrestrials, and then one day, someone will give them another name. But it's always the same story. The one about beings greater than us, who left something behind. A mark, a ruin, a spark. And in searching for them, what we really find is the shape of our own imagination. The last tomb. Let's go back, one last time, to that lonely museum record. Un cuerpo momificado, gran tamaño, procedente de Chihuahua, a mummified body of large size. Maybe it was just a note in a logbook. Maybe it was something more. Either way, it did what all mysteries do. It planted a seed. A single line of ink that made generations of seekers look again at the sands of Mexico and wonder. If one record like that could vanish, how many others have? And if they all whispered the same story of giants, of builders, of ancient visitors, what would that say about us? Maybe the truth isn't in the bones, but in the persistence of the search itself. The memory of earth science will keep digging. Skeptics will keep asking for evidence. Believers will keep finding signs in stone and star. And somewhere in between all that, in the space between disbelief and faith, is where the real story lives. Because the earth doesn't lie. It just hides things until we're ready to see them. The tombs, the caves, the forgotten mountains. They're not keeping secrets. They're keeping balance. They remind us that not everything was meant to be proven. Some things were meant to be felt. The giants awaken. So maybe the giants never left. Maybe they are not in the ground at all. Maybe they're inside us, in the parts of our minds that still believe in wonder, that still ache for mystery, that still look up at the stars and ask, who taught us to build? That's the real awakening. Not bones in a cave, but curiosity stirring in the human heart. That's what makes civilizations rise. That's what keeps us searching. And maybe that's what the ancients wanted all along. For us to never stop wondering. The fade to night, so as the lights dim and the world grows quiet. Remember this, somewhere out there, beneath centuries of sand and silence, history still breathes. Whether those giants ever walked the earth, or whether they were only the dreams of our ancestors, they've done what every legend hopes to do. They've made us look again at the ground beneath our feet, and the sky above our heads. The truth may be buried, but curiosity is eternal. Sleep well, and when you dream tonight, may you dream of giants, not as monsters or myths, but as echoes of the greatness we're still trying to remember.